Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time zone you're in. I'd like to welcome you to this session on building an equitable scientific community, lessons learned from C. elegans researchers involved in DEI initiatives. My name is Anna Allen, and I'm a professor at Howard University in Washington, D.C., and I'm proud to chair this session. In 2020, upon recommendation of the Equity and Inclusion Committee, the Genetic Society of America committed to giving diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI programming, non-competing space at meetings. This started with a session at the 2020 TAGC and then continued with two separate sessions at the Drosophila 2021 meeting, one a plenary session and one a concurrent session. I'm really excited today that Worm 21 is the first Worm meeting to have a non-competing DEI session, thereby allowing all registrants to attend, and that we have the largest number of registrants from across the globe that are able to view this. I'd also like to state that the Equity and Inclusion Committee within GSA is doing amazing work to make the GSA community more inclusive. So check out the committee and all its programmatic efforts. And if you're interested, consider applying in the future to become a member of this really important committee. It would be great not to be the only worm researcher among a dozen Drosophila researchers on this committee. So this diversity, equity, and inclusion session has been designed to promote scholarship and to share expertise on DEI topics in line with the goal of moving toward a more equitable scientific enterprise. Most specialists or worm researchers like us are not in the habit of submitting DEI work to our scientific conferences. And conversely, most DEI specialists are not in the habit of submitting their work to model organism conferences like this. For this year, we, the organizers, have identified speakers within the worm community to present to you on their DEI initiatives. But in the future, we are hopeful that we will have a large enough submission of DEI abstracts to choose among in selecting the speakers for future DEI sessions. And perhaps in the future, we can bring in speakers from outside the worm community to share on their DEI initiatives. So for today's session, we have a lineup of 3 fantastic speakers who will each present for 15 minutes. After their presentations, we have allotted a set Q&A period. Questions can and should be entered into the Zoom Q&A panel at any point during a speaker's presentation. And then after all 3 speakers have presented, myself and Sarah Bay from GSA will then moderate those questions. So first up for our speakers in this session is Dr. David Katz, Associate Professor from Emory University. The title of his presentation is The Pipeline Cure, Lowering Institutional Barriers to Research by Reiteratively Incorporating Original C. elegans Experiments Throughout a Biology Curriculum. David, are you ready to start?
Yes, I am. Okay. Let me share. Can everybody see that?
Looks good to me.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Sarah, for putting together this session on such a really important topic. So I'm delighted today to be talking about a collaboration that I have between Emory University and a nearby Oglethorpe University, in which we've reiteratively incorporated C. elegans experiments into the classroom at Oglethorpe. So hopefully most of you all will be familiar with the idea that undergraduate research is associated with student success. So just one way that people have looked at that, can everybody see the pointer, by the way?
I can see it.
Okay, good. So just one way that people have looked at that is looking at the probability of graduation between undergraduate students that engage in research in blue versus no research in yellow. As you can see, there's a significant increase in the graduation rate for undergraduate students who engage in research. If we break that down then by demographics, what we can see is compared to white and Asian populations, which have high graduation rates, the graduation rates amongst Native Americans, Hispanic, and African Americans, populations that are traditionally underrepresented in STEM, are much lower than that. However, if those students engage in undergraduate research, you can see here in the blue bars that the graduation rates approach what are seen in their white and Asian colleagues. So my lab is at Emory University, which is a large research-intensive university. And if you're an undergraduate at Emory, you have a large number of labs to choose from. So students typically approach me in their freshman and sophomore years. They learn C. elegans, or in the case of my lab, also mouse, over the first year or so. And then they work with a graduate student or postdoc in the subsequent year or two to engage in, to help them in their research project. And ultimately, typically in their senior year, they engage in original novel research project, typically a senior research thesis. However, just a couple of miles away at Oglethorpe University, which is a liberal arts college, this is a school that has 1,400 students or so. Greater than 50% of those students are students of color. 40% are first generation students, and 47% are Pell Grant recipients. And yet, because it's a small liberal arts college, they don't have any research labs to choose from. So Karen Schmeichel, who is a professor at Oglethorpe University, approached me a number of years ago and said, can my students come over to Emory to gain, short research experience? And I think initially we had in mind, basically a week experience, maybe a little bit shorter or longer than that. Ultimately, over the next couple of years, this morphed into students actually coming from Oglethorpe to Emory to engage in long-term research projects. And it resulted in the first ever senior research thesis in the 180-year history of Oglethorpe University. So Karen and I were pretty proud of that. However, when we started to think about it, what we realized is that this kind of a collaboration impacts a limited number of students. And because it's opt-in, it failed to reach many of the students who would benefit the most. And so like many of you out there in the audience, our solution to that was to try and engage in a course-based undergraduate research experience. So needs no introduction here, but C. elegans is a beautiful system for this. And so what we decided to do was to try and incorporate some RNAi screens based on research that was going on in my lab at Emory into a junior level developmental biology class at Oglethorpe. And despite the fact that C. elegans is a relatively simple system and doesn't take that much to pick up, we still found that over a semester, there was a steep technical learning curve. And by the end of the semester, there was really very little time for original research. And so although we were able to engage more students, we ultimately felt that our cure was a bit of a disappointment. And so Karen and I went and had to think about it. And we said, how can we recapitulate some of the benefits that students get, at Emory in a typical apprentice style system in my lab in the classroom at Oglethorpe? And our solution is what we have termed the pipeline cure. And that is an iterative approach to introduce C. elegans research into all 4 years of the curriculum. So briefly, the students in the first year in introductory classes perform a 2-week monohybrid cross. This is their first experience with C. elegans and has a known outcome. In their second year, they typically extend that now to a slightly longer experience where they do chromosomal linkage mapping, also with a known outcome. As juniors in developmental biology, they now engage in a full semester RNAi candidate screen. And this is similar to what we initially started, but because of the initial 2 experiences, the students actually know C. elegans husbandry, they all have worm picks, and they're actually able to engage in original research over a semester. And ultimately, as seniors, they can opt to take what we've referred to as a capstone course. This is a full semester taught by a postdoc in the CATS lab. And this is novel original research that supports the postdoc's project at Emory University. And what we mean by novel original research is that the students are much more involved in planning what experiments they're going to do and determining based on their initial results what the next experiment is going to be. And because Karen and I are scientists, we wanted to know whether or not our pipeline cure actually recapitulates some of the benefits that are traditionally seen in the apprentice style system. So we took pre and post surveys across the entire pipeline cure, and we looked at the impact on understanding concepts and on attitudes. And that's what primarily I would like to share with you today, the data from that. So in all the data that I'm going to show you, we have broken down the different stages into colors. Stage 1 is in blue, stage 2 is in orange, stage 3 is in pink, and stage 4 is in green. Each one of the arrows that I'm going to show you, the beginning part of the arrow is the pre-course survey, the end part of the arrow is the post-course survey. And again, this is across the different stages. And if you look to the right, the black arrow represents the how the students actually change over the entire pipeline cure. I would also like to point out these are the number of students that we have been able to survey thus far. So if we start out looking at learning objectives, fortunately, we can see that in a number of different questions here on the right with the black lines, there's a significant improvement over the 4 years. So that made us feel good. This is maybe not surprising because, for example, these questions are about epigenetic inheritance and chromatin, which are things that we cover throughout the pipeline. But if you delve in more closely, what you'll see is actually the most significant or the largest improvement actually occurs in stage 4, where you have this novel original research. And the same thing is true with chromatin modifications. Again, the largest improvement is in stage 4. And that actually includes also a question that we had about RNA interference. And keep in mind that the students were performing an entire semester of RNA interference experiments in stage 3. And yet, even with stage 3, they really didn't show much improvement over the semester in the pink shown here. But when they actually engaged themselves in the novel research based on that using RNA interference, you can see that there was a dramatic improvement from pre to post. Okay, now what about attitudes? There are some benefits that we see upon the initial exposure to the research. So for example, if we ask, I understand why genetic model organisms are important in biological research, we see that the largest improvement occurs in stage 1, the initial introduction to C. elegans. And that's also true for a statement like, I know how to design an experiment that includes the use of model organisms. Again, the largest improvement is over stage 1. In addition, we see that some benefits require exposure to the same system twice and the switch to original research. So for example, if we ask, when my experiments in lab are inconclusive, my first reaction is to repeat them. What you can see is that in the first 2 stages, the students don't improve that much. However, following 2 reiterative introductions to the same system, the students actually make a significant jump between stage 2 and stage 3, and then they continue to improve upon first introduction to original research in stage 3. That's also true if we ask, I feel confident in my skills as a researcher. Again, there's a significant jump between stage 2 and stage 3, and it continues to improve over stage 3. And likewise, doing lab work in my classes makes me feel like a scientist. So in addition, we were very excited that the pipeline cure recapitulates the loss of beginners' confidence. So all of you out there will know that one of the most important things to learn in a lab experience is that research is difficult. Asking novel, trying to figure out nature is hard. And a lot of times experiments, they fail. And often that's not necessarily recapitulated in a classroom environment. But what we can see here in the pipeline cure, for example, if we ask, course-associated lab work helps me understand the scientific method. Initially, the students start out with a lot of beginner confidence, but by stage 2, you can see that the confidence goes down, and it doesn't rebound until they actually have exposure to original research in stage 3 and 4. The same is true if we ask, when performing an experiment, I look forward to collecting my final data. Again, the students start with a lot of confidence and it goes down by stage 2 and recovers when we expose them to original research in stage 3 and 4. And finally, my lab work makes me feel confident in my ideas. Again, between stage 1 and stage 2, the confidence goes down and then it recovers in stage 3 and 4. So in addition, we find that completion of original research is required to recapitulate some benefits of the apprentice style research. So for example, if we ask, course-associated lab work contributes to my mastery of biological concepts, understanding things in class. What we find is that we really don't see that much of an improvement over stages 1, 2, and 3. But after completing stage 3, having gone through the system reiteratively, we see there is a jump into improvement of understanding concepts to stage 4. The same is true if we ask if they simply enjoy doing lab work as part of their classes. Again, not a lot of improvement over the first 3 stages, but once you've reiteratively been reintroduced to the same C. elegans system, by stage 4, they enjoy doing the lab work as part of classes much more. And finally, if I had time, I would like to continue the C. elegans based project that we started in class. And you can see not much success in stage 1 and 2, but a huge jump to the novel original research that we see in stage 4. In addition, the reiterative exposure and completion of original research is required for the benefit of attitudes towards future careers. So one of the things that students get in apprentice-style research experience is a real stepping stone to a future career in science. And what we find in the pipeline cure is that if we ask, the lab work I do in my classes will help me pursue future training opportunities. In stages 1 and 2, we really don't see much. But after seeing the same system twice, there's a jump to stage 3, and then a further jump to stage 4 when they go from original research to more novel original research. And the same is true as if we ask, I anticipate doing laboratory research in my future career. So unfortunately, in all 3 of the first stages, from pre to post, the responses go down. The only exception to that is in the 4th most novel original research experience. And you can see now there's a little bit of an increase in students reporting that they might want to do research in their career. I should also note that one of the benefits of doing research in a typical R1 institution is that students are able to publish papers, which facilitates the next stages in their career. And we've been able to recapitulate that in the pipeline cure. For example, here is a recent 2021 developmental biology paper published from my lab. Here is an actual RNAi experiment that was done by a student, Jovan Brockett, completely conceived by himself within the class confines and actually executed completely within the normal curriculum. And finally, we see that there's an increase in confidence in research abilities that requires really the reiterative exposure across all 4 years. So for example, if we ask, I am skillful in lab work, we can see that across stage 1, 2, 3, and 4, it continues to improve directly over the entire time, as it might during an apprentice style situation. Or if we ask, I feel confident in my skills as a researcher, again, it continues to increase across all 4 stages of the pipeline. And finally, I have a strong understanding of what it means to do scientific research. Again, increasing across all of the stages of the pipeline cure. So what hopefully I've shown you today is that repeated exposure and in-depth exploration of a unified research system can recapitulate the benefits of an apprentice-style research entirely within the classroom. And what's so important about doing it entirely within a classroom is we believe that that helps lower the barrier of entry by expanding the benefits of research to all students, particularly underrepresented minorities who might benefit the most of it and who might have the hardest time trying to opt into a typical apprentice-style system. So I encourage you to seek out this paper if you're interested in learning more. And what I would like to leave you with is an encouragement that in this community, C. elegans, we believe, is the perfect system for doing reiterative cures. And so you can do this too, including we think that there's really no reason why this can't be scaled to a much farther situation where there's an R1 lab that's in one institution and a PUI in another institution. And we think this can be done across a large time and space scale. So with that, I would like to thank the following people. Obviously, Karen Schmeichel, who is my partner at Oglethorpe through all of this, who helped me implement the pipeline cure. 3 postdocs in my lab, Teresa Lee and Brandon Carpenter, who helped basically develop the pipeline, and Honor Barol, who actually did most of the collection and analysis of the data that I showed you. These people in my lab who helped out, and especially the faculty and students of Oglethorpe's biology department. Finally, I would like to thank, this was all funded by the NSF. It was also supported by the Palm Network, and the postdocs in my lab were supported by Aractive Fellowships from the NIH. Thank you very much, and I'll take questions after the other 2 talks.
Thanks, David. I'll clap for everybody in the audience. If you have questions for David, please put it in the question and answer panel. We're already getting them. Now we're going to move on to our next presenter, Dr. Nidhi Bahala. She's a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the title of her talk is Strategies to Improve Equity in Faculty Hiring. Nidhi?
Okay, can you hear me and see my screen?
Can see you and hear it.
Awesome. Okay, so before I start talking about strategies for equity in faculty hiring, I just want to identify one of the organizations that I'm involved with that is focused on changing how we assess research, improving how research is assessed. And this is DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment. And so this was an organization that was founded at an ASCB meeting several years ago to sort of move away from flawed proxies to assess research. And I'll talk about what that means. Okay, so this is a slide that I hate. This slide shows that as we ascend the academic hierarchy from associates to full professors, we see a dramatic shift in the demographic makeup as we ascend the academic hierarchy, where some demographic groups are overrepresented and some demographic groups are underrepresented. And this point is made even more clear in a paper by Kenny Gibbs in 2017, where he showed that despite the dramatic increase in the number of underrepresented PhD students, there was no concomitant increase in the number of underrepresented faculty members. And this is even more, this point is made even more strongly when we look at gender, where if we look at female PhD students who are now making up a majority of our graduate student population in biology and biomedical sciences, that increase, again, is not represented in the number of faculty that are female. And so before I go on to talking about promoting equity in faculty hiring, I want to introduce you to a couple of terms that I'll sort of use interchangeably. So normally we've used the term members of underrepresented groups, or URM, or underrepresented minority. I'm going to use terms like historically excluded, historically marginalized, or minoritized to represent the fact that these groups there's a power system that actively works against their ascent and towards their marginalization, so that we can counter that narrative. And one thing that this data shows me and shows lots of other people is that the way that we assess research is flawed. If there are some demographics that are very well represented and that they continue to be overrepresented as we ascend the academic hierarchy, this tells us that there is something flawed about how we assess research and how we assess contributions to the biomedical sciences, and that it's something that we have to change about how we assess research and contributions to the biomedical sciences. Because of this disparity or discrepancy, I wrote a perspective in 2019, Strategies to Improve Equity in Faculty Hiring, and I'll discuss some of the strategies in this talk. But this perspective highlighted evidence-based strategies, both in biomedical sciences and in other fields, to make research assessment more equitable and to result in a higher frequency of hiring minoritized faculty members from the graduate student and postdoc population in which they are better represented. So some of these evidence-based strategies are to develop a thoughtful and explicit commitment to equity, to develop a rubric to assess diversity statements and use them early in research evaluation or assessment, to use mechanisms to avoid relying on flawed assessment proxies, using cluster hires to achieve critical mass and limit isolation of minoritized faculty members, and to identify promising late-stage postdoc candidates and invite them for seminars or to apply for positions. And what does it mean to develop a thoughtful and explicit commitment to equity? It means that as departments or institutions, we need to be prepared to explicitly answer the reasons why our departments or universities should address equity during the faculty hiring process. There's always an argument made for the value of diverse teams, but it's also true that addressing equity can be a deliberate attempt to correct for the structural marginalization of some demographics in our institutions and in our departments. And as our trainee populations become more diverse, that we need to provide role models for the graduates or undergraduate students that we are currently training or mentoring. And our commitment to equity can include all of these priorities when we're considering how we want to address equity in our departments and our institutions. The other thing is that coming up with this thoughtful commitment to equity will actually inform other practices in the department or the university and make them more equitable. So the teaching and training of students, the mentorship and sponsorship of students and faculty, the retention of students in our majors or our programs, as highlighted in the previous talk, the promotion and retention of faculty, and the improvement of climate and culture will all be improved by an evaluation of how we can support equity in our institutions and our departments. And the reality is that by addressing equity, we will be improving the experiences of all faculty during hiring and promotion, and potentially improving the experiences of graduate students who are training in our departments. Further, this commitment to equity will inform the job ad, its placement and recruitment, because this will allow us to identify that we need to take a proactive versus a passive approach to recruitment, which is often the tactic that we take, and that we actually may need to demonstrate our departmental commitment to the applicant if our department doesn't already have evidence of support of these historically excluded groups from faculty positions. Postdocs and graduate students see the data of who goes on to faculty positions. They properly assess that data and factor that into their decision-making. And if we want to demonstrate a commitment to the success of graduate students and postdocs in becoming faculty if they are minoritized, we need to actively illustrate that if we can't demonstrate that with our hiring practices thus far. So after we've developed a commitment to equity, we need to reconsider our assessment practices. And that means redefining excellence and merit, because the reality is that our metrics of excellence and merit are currently flawed and geared towards the overrepresentation of some demographics. So we often rely on flawed proxies that maintain structural marginalization. For example, where people have published, where people have trained, and who people have trained with have already been shown to exhibit disparities and bias. Further, there's a diversity innovation paradox, which was nicely illustrated in a paper in 2020 by Hofstra et al. And this showed that minoritized scholars actually innovate at higher rates, and innovation was defined as introducing links between previously unlinked concepts. But these novel contributions are often discounted or not, and by that they mean not adopted by others in the field, and often didn't result in retention in academia. And so that paradox, again, demonstrates the inconsistency in our assessment practices and demonstrates that we have to reevaluate our assessment practices. We should develop mechanisms that move away from the inappropriate use of these flawed proxies. And so one example is Sandra Schmidt's suggestion to have applicants identify and contextualize their graduate and postdoc work in their cover letter. And this way we would move away from those flawed proxies of where they've published and where they've trained. And then we should formalize our assessment practices by using either formal or informal rubrics. And what that means is that often we come in and people bring different standards to how they're assessing applications, and often those standards can vary from application to application. And what we actually want to do is calibrate our assessments. And so we might actively do this by taking a subset of applications, having members score and articulate why they scored them. And an important thing here is that these scores don't necessarily need to be the same between members, but they do need to be individually consistent so that when somebody is scoring an application, they can articulate why, and then other people can comment on the inconsistency or the consistency, and then you can institute a formal or an informal rubric for the assessment of those applications. And then another thing that we can do is to approach the candidate assessment holistically. And one way to do this is to use diversity statements. What do I mean by using diversity statements to assess candidates holistically? And so what I mean is a tactic that has been successful at several institutions, including my own at UC Santa Cruz. And when we talk about diversity statements, we talk about focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion as expertise. Because what we have to develop as researchers, as trainers, as mentors, and as teachers is the ability to be able to participate in these practices in a multiracial society. Identity can be a major contributor to this expertise. Further, diversity statements makes typical work that's typically seen as invisible, visible. So often minoritized scientists, as they're undergoing their training through their graduate school and during their postdoc, they often have to simultaneously undergo training and work to dismantle the barriers that they've overcome to accomplish that training. And that means that they often have to divide their energy in a way that both contributes to their success, but also contributes to the institution. And so diversity statements, one, allows them to discuss that work and make it visible. Two, to introduce it as expertise, because that is what it is. And to contextualize their research experience if it may have affected research, what we typically use to assess research. And so institutions have to commit to use diversity statements in this way, and it's part of their commitment to equity. They have to commit to using these diversity statements early in research evaluation, so it's factored in their assessment of their research and or their CV. And so, for example, at UC, we have a rubric that we use to assess diversity statements, and this primarily identifies 3 areas: knowledge of diversity, equity, and inclusion, previous examples of work, and future plans for work. So these are concrete illustrations and demonstrations of this expertise. And again, we want to calibrate our assessment of these diversity statements, particularly because often when we're assessing diversity statements, we don't have paradigms to fall back on the way that we think we do for research assessment. And so we want to take a small subset of applications, have all committee members assess and discuss how they assess them and articulate why they scored them a certain way. Again, these scores don't necessarily need to be the same between the members, but they do need to be internally or individually consistent. And these calibrations allow the group to develop agreement on how significantly to weigh the contribution of expertise in diversity, equity, and inclusion during the final assessment of the faculty candidate. And I just want to say that we have an example of holistic assessment. This is how a lot of institutions do graduate admissions. And so we have a paradigm to fall back on when we think about using holistic assessment during faculty assessment or research assessment. Now, these are all suggestions that are the product of having seen hires move through my own institution and at other institutions. And as a result of these experiences, there are things that we learned that worked and didn't work. And so before I go on, I want to go into what some of the lessons that we learned as part of this process. Okay, so you need to be prepared for and develop responses to resistance. There's going to be resistance at your institution. There's going to be resistance in your department. There's going to be a sense of, why do we need to change? This is how we've always done it. There's going to be an insistence that structural marginalization doesn't contribute to the underrepresentation of some demographics and overrepresentation of others. And there's going to be an insistence that academia is a meritocracy or that science is objective. We know none of this is true. There has historically been marginalization of some groups, and that this marginalization is maintained in our current structures, and that is why we see the disparities we see. There can also be some concern that minoritized faculty members won't succeed. And so we have to often counter that concern trolling to make sure that those things don't actually contribute to the reduced assessment of faculty members. And then there's going to be serious discomfort about discussing inequity. There's going to be conversations about reverse racism, concerns about legality because of Proposition 209. This is an issue that we have to come up with in California. And so often, if you are focused on promoting equity during research assessment and during faculty hiring, you're going to have to develop a skill set that allows you to respond to this resistance. And one resource that I have found incredibly useful for this is a resource generated by several students and trainees, which are responses to 10 common criticism of anti-racism action in STEM. There are other situations in which there's marginalization, for example, disability or gender. And so developing responses to some of these resistance in your organizations can actually further promote equity in your department and eventually produce more equitable hiring in your department. And so this is a really great resource. And I encourage everyone to go to this website, antiracisminstem.wordpress.com, if you would like some resources to develop some arguments against some of this resistance. Another thing that we didn't realize when we were doing our more equitable faculty hiring is that we need to be prepared for partner hire opportunities. And so we knew that this was likely going to be an issue when we were going to be hiring women faculty members, but this is actually a major issue when we are also hiring minoritized male faculty members. Often at a higher rate, they have partners who are also on the faculty job market. And these are opportunities. These are not deficits. To have the opportunity to actually get multiple faculty candidates who are qualified and prepared is actually, I mean, this was actually something that we were not prepared for, and it turned out to be a huge boon during our faculty hiring process. The inclusion of diversity statements allows members of search committees to actually identify candidates who may play important future leadership roles in the department. These faculty candidates have already learned how to take on leadership roles, have already learned how to work within structures to promote change. And these will end up being useful because we all know that as we become faculty, our roles increase, and having those skills under their belt puts them in a position of leadership already in the department. In addition, these processes helped us identify equity advocates in the department, which would allow us to address concerns raised by candidates and by faculty once they've been hired, minoritized faculty once they've been hired. And these equity advocates play an important role, continuing their role advocating for candidates after hiring, because once you've hired a minoritized candidate, then the focus becomes retention. Retention is still a challenge. And so once you've hired a minoritized faculty candidate, you want to focus on what you can do to retain that minoritized faculty candidate to ensure their success. And as a reference for this, there's a great video of a seminar by Michael Taff on ways to support and retain minoritized faculty that has a particular focus on NIH funding. And so you can find that on YouTube. So that's the end of my talk, and I will take questions. I will answer questions in the Q&A, and I will answer questions after the entire session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nidhi. That was really great. And I know it's starting to generate questions already that you'll have to answer. So we're going to move on now to Dr. Pamela Padilla. She's a professor and associate vice president for research and innovation at the University of North Texas. Also just recently appointed as Dean of UNT's College of Science. She also serves as president of SACNAS, Society for Advancing Chicanos and Hispanics and Native Americans in Science. And the title of her talk will be Building Intentional Networks and Partnerships Within and Across Scientific Societies to Reach True Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in STEM.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate that the Worm Meeting and Genetic Society of America put on this session. It's something that's near and dear to my heart. And it's certainly something that I appreciate what Nettie, the previous speakers have said, especially Nettie Bala, who's talked about the marginalized groups, as well as individuals who have had to work simultaneously on their scientific career while also dismantling aspects of barriers within institutes. And so I'm someone who's been doing this for now, I think, 2 decades. And so before I move on, I want to also recognize my colleague, Sonia Zarate. She's a director, program director at Howard Hughes Medical Institute, and she is the previous SOCNAS president who I work closely with, and I'm now the current president for SOCNAS. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SOCNAS. But before I get into that, I'd like to bring up the word true diversity. And that's something that's within the framework of what we've built SOCNAS around. And what it really means is that within particular fields, and the one that we're interested in are within the sciences, everywhere from the students all the way up to leadership that has roles in making important decisions. Within that whole framework, that there really is a representation of the demographics within the nation, within the region, within the states, if we're in the United States, et cetera. That's truly what we're reaching for. And that framework is really dependent upon equity and inclusion. So having equitable practices and inclusion within, say, if we're talking about sciences. This is something that's really important to the United States to address, and we're beginning to address it much more so, I'd say, in the last 5 years than we have done previously. And there's countless amounts of data out there that show when you have a diverse group that is addressing or looking at a problem, needing a solution, that you actually end up with better outcomes. And so the question that I want to bring today is, we can do this within our classrooms that was demonstrated within the practices within the university, but I also want to talk about scientific societies in particular. And one of the aspects, this kind of follows along the theme that the previous presenter talked about, which is that there has been record of intentional and historical biases, and even at the approach of racism and misogynistic approaches within different institutes. And when I mean institutes, I mean within academia, within funding agencies, within government, industry, even societies, et cetera. And so many of those have been removed, especially the ones that are really blatant. But we still have a lot of need within these different institutes, and also approaches to be able to remove these barriers that are still in place. And so with that, the question is what can scientific societies do? And I would say that they're more likely in this future and now to actually be taking a very intentional look at how to be more inclusive and equitable. And this session is an example, a prime example of how that's been done, but it is the first time that this has been done for the WORM community. And so we're very used to the societies being a platform to be able to provide conferences, an opportunity for networking, ability for our students and ourselves and lead PIs, et cetera, to publish and present, et cetera. All of this is really important, but if you don't have some lens in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially the equity and inclusion part of it, then that's something that's going to impact all of these different processes that are so important for developing a scientific career. There are several societies, I'm just listing a couple of them here, that have made definite work and progress in these areas. American Chemical Society, which is a really big national society, they've developed a committee called Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Respect. They have a strategic plan, the same with the American Society for Cell Biology, who's actually been doing this for many years. They've developed a workforce diversity policies. They have long-standing support for financial support for different DEI programs. And then they also have a strategic plan. And then I'm very happy to see that Genetic Society also is working towards this, where they have a committee and then these type of sessions within the GSA. But historically, the scientific societies did not have these types of opportunities. And so as a consequence of that, there were various scientific organizations that were formed sort of in a grassroots effort to be able to address the needs of marginalized and minoritized groups. And one of them is called SOCNAS. This stands for the Society for the Advancement of Chicano, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. This is a society that's approaching its 50th year anniversary, so that somehow gives you an indication of how far back the need was recognized and how long this society has persisted. Okay, hold on. There we go. And so the society itself has a mission and vision. The vision is to approach true diversity and to truly achieve that within the STEM fields. The mission is very inclusive. That means that anyone can join this organization. It's a very, very welcoming organization, but it still focuses on a specific demographic that has a high need. The Chicano Hispanic community, this is the fastest growing demographic within the United States, and also the Native American community, which has been one of the most marginalized groups in the nation for centuries. And so with that, what the mission is to really reach out to these communities to provide lots of opportunities for career, academic development, as well as opportunities for leadership, all within the STEM fields. And so it's not K through 12, but it's from undergraduate all the way up to professionals focused on across the STEM disciplines. It is the largest STEM diversity organization within the country. We have well over 8,000 active members. And so we're not counting the whole 16,000 that have come in and out through time with their membership. This is ran as a nonprofit. It's a very small group of highly motivated individuals that do a lot of work. And so with that, we have elected board of directors. I served on the board of directors in 2016 to 18. And then we also have executive committee members and then presidents. And again, I came on again in the recent year and was elected president for this organization. I work very closely with the past presidents as well as an executive director, Dr. Stephanie Herrera, who leads the operations and has 12 to 14 staff. The work really gets done by hundreds of volunteers that put in thousands of hours across the nation to support various committees. And so we have committees and subcommittees, various task forces, as well as an advisory group of past presidents and founders. And so a lot of people may know about this organization because of the conference that we have. We have a national conference that occurs usually within the fall. This last year, it was virtual in October, and this coming year, it's going to be virtual as well, October 25th through 29th, but we'll have one in Puerto Rico in 2022. We expect we have been having well over 5,000 attendees to these conferences. And they also support leadership programs as well as regional meetings. And so sometimes it's difficult for some of the individuals within our community and our members to be able to travel. And so instead, they are also supported through regional meetings. Another opportunity is the national chapters. So we have over 118 of them, and we expect to grow those even more. Primarily, they're within academic institutes. So a lot of our Hispanic serving institutes have national chapters, but they're also within many other institutes as well. And it serves as a way to help students be able to form a network of individuals on campus to meet their needs that they have during their academic and research programming. We also have chapters within various industry partners such as Procter & Gamble, and within the government like National Institutes of Health. We have YouTube channels where a lot of our year-round programming is delivered, as well as social media. I encourage students to always go to the YouTube channels and watch some of the various type of platforms. We have everything from interviews. One of our example would be one of our Native American chairs within Iowa, first one within material science, as well as how do you best do X? So examples would be providing an abstract for a conference, all sorts of different things that students would like to have extra information on, and then a lot of other communications as well. This past year, I've been working on the strategic plan with leading a task force, and we'll be releasing that over the next year. So again, this is all volunteer work and things that we need to do within our community to be able to serve members that have felt marginalized within the sciences. We've had great support in recent years from National Institutes of Health. We have 2 grants. One is an R13, which is a conference grant, which helps support parts of the conference that we'll be using. As well, I'm PI on an R25 training grant, which really focuses on developing these chapters across the nation, reaching out to Native American communities, and then third, helping postdocs transition into their next career steps. And those are the gaps that we noticed in terms of the need within the community that this grant was addressing. So we're really excited to have been awarded that this past year. With that, our conferences will also support through these grants hundreds of students to attend. And so the virtual one, we would have hundreds to be able to have pay for their scholarship for them to attend the conference, as well as when we're in person, give them travel support. It also supports keynote speakers. We've had some amazing speakers, including Martin Chelfie, who is this, well-known, obviously Nobel laureate. We like to bring in individuals who we know our students would be able to learn a lot from, as well as represent the high success of even like winning a Nobel Prize within the sciences. And then we also have a lot of scientific sessions as well as professional development. So sessions on how to write grants, thinking about and even having the opportunity to meet grant program directors at the conference as well. So there's lots of different opportunities within these short days of the session of the actual conference. So we assess the conference as well as the programs that we do. And I'm just going to run through a couple of examples that show that continually these programs are really helping and reaching out to students. We get statements back from some, and sometimes you're able to get the demographics out. So here's an example of Native American student responses where they said attending the conference really motivated them. The information was really excellent and good to help them pursue and think about pursuing their PhDs within different programs. And then we also focus during that conference as well as year round on the something that's really important, which is mentorship. And so being able to provide an opportunity for students and postdoc to meet others to be able to get information and resources. And so we have close to 80% of the students that attend and that responded to this survey said that they received some form of mentorship, which is excellent. Here's a few examples of quotes that we get when we conduct our surveys. And so again, this is not qualitative, but after reading pages and pages, this is very familiar and very similar to what the type of responses that we get when we do our assessment. And so one of the common themes is that the students feel that the conference helps address a specific need throughout their research. So they may address that their home institute is great at research, at mentoring them, but there's still some components that might be missing. That includes the diversity and cultural awareness at their home institutes. So it's helpful for them to come back to a place, meet other individuals that may not be within the specific field that they are, but also have some similarities in terms of their background. And so this particular individual says that sometimes at their home institute, which is great, they have to explain a lot of things, and they have to explain who they are and what their perspectives are. And that's coming from someone who's a Native American student. It reminds them that they're in the right field. So often we see that it re-energizes them, helps them get reinvigorated, and motivated to continue within the STEM fields. And so that's something that we really strive for, is giving them that type of environment where they feel like they're included in terms of within the sciences. And so what are other things that scientific societies can do aside from those like SOCNAS? And so I have 4 different bullet points that I'd like to share. One of them that I would encourage, and I do this because I reach out and work with various scientific societies, so including Genetics Society of America, is really to think about how could you gather data so that the work that you're doing really provides an infrastructure that shows that you're having an impact in terms of equity and inclusion within your practices. And so I would promote that not only should data be gathered, but also not evaluated and shared with other scientific societies so that we all move forward in the STEM fields to reach that true diversity aspect. Second, I would say that building intentional partnerships is very important within the nation. And so an example of that is partnerships between, say, having SOCNUS and another society like American Chemical Society. We have a partnership with them. It's very intentional. And what we do is we share practices, as well as I, as president, sit on the DEIR committee for ACS. And so that's an example where you can get what I call cross-pollination of individuals within one group into others as well. And so you have that extra voice that's occurring. Of course, there's a lot of scientific societies that move in and partner with SOCNUS in terms of having scientific sessions at the conference. And that is something that I would include as a goal as well. And the nice thing is that NSF just put out a program called LEAPS, Leading Cultural Change Through Professional Societies, to be able to build the framework and encourage with money for these societies to look forward. So that's something I'd like GSA to consider looking at. SOCNUS is already being approached by many in this place. Third is individuals within, such as you, can have particular actions, attend SOCNUS, support your students to go, write into your grants for them to go participate in the chapters or build a chapter at your home institute. There's lots of different opportunities. And then if you have a posting, just like our previous speaker was noting, that it's important to outreach and really build a broad advertisement for potential candidates. And so that could be done at the SOCNUS Opportunity Board. And I have the link right here if you're interested in posting any sort of job opportunities, and especially faculty positions within our organization. And then finally, I'd like to say is that the federal government has gotten much better in the last several years, especially NIH. In fact, Francis Collins came out with something today in Cell, and including a publication on the efforts and things that they're doing within the NIH to really address historic barriers and racism within the Institute. And so there's lots of different links that they provide. They provide toolkits on helping think about unconscious bias. And so within your departments, you might be able to come up with needs such as that. So I really encourage to reach out and look and learn about a lot of the different publications and aspects that you can use within your own group about DEI. And so with that, I just really want to thank the organizers. I think this is such an important topic. I was very pleased that I was invited to give a talk about this, and lots of work that I've been doing as a C. elegans researcher as well as within SOCNUS. And so I know we're running short on time, but I'm also willing to answer questions for, as long as people have them, I'm here for people.
Thanks so much, Pamela. And Needy and David. And I apologize for letting them go over. I was so interested in all of their talks, I couldn't bring myself to interrupt them. So that's my bad as a moderator for this. We do have till 2:30, so we can start to take some questions now. Sarah, do you want to go with the first one?
Sure. I was going to ask quickly to Needy, do you have advice on best practices in writing the prompts for the diversity statements? Pitfalls in language to be aware of to make sure that the prompts for the statements are as inclusive as possible?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have been incredibly lucky at UC that this has come down from the top administrative levels at UC, and so the prompts have been as wide-ranging as possible, and the rubric is as wide-ranging as possible. I'm not quite sure if this is coming from the place of somebody wanting to ask for diversity statements, or if people are, this person is asking how to respond to diversity statements. So
Faculty member thinking about how to ask for diversity
yeah,
statements.
I mean, I would use the ones that are already available. There, several institutions have already started to and this was a question that was asked that I was also going to ask. There are several institutions that are now using diversity statements, not only in faculty hiring, but also in promotion and tenure review. And so many of them, because they know that there's this uncertainty about how they're going to be assessed and how they're being used, they have made either the prompts publicly available, the rubrics publicly available, and provided examples on their websites of what they consider good diversity statements. I will say that there's this sense that diversity statements are separate from the work that we do as faculty members or as trainees or as mentors. But the reality is that our diversity work suffuses so many aspects of our of the work that we do. And you want in asking in prompts for diversity statements, I think what you want to show is you want to ask that people have an understanding of what that means. And you want people to be able to articulate the work that they've done in several different spheres to demonstrate their understanding of promoting change either at their institution and how they plan to do it at your institution.
Excellent, thank you. Dave, we had a quick question on how you, what criteria you use when you're selecting students to participate in the pipeline cure.
I think this is a really important question because the answer is there are no criteria. In fact, many of the students who get involved in the pipeline don't even know they're getting involved. They just register for a class. And I think that's what's so important about it, that it's not opt-in. There aren't selection criteria. And we even have students, one of the things that was noted in the chat is that in the first two iterations that are non-original research, known outcomes, there's a lot of sort of negative feelings towards the research, and then it changes. And how do you prevent those people from dropping out? And the answer is, we found that they really don't drop out because again, when they sign up for their junior and senior classes, they're just signing up for normal and junior senior classes. So sometimes there's students who don't like the experience originally and then find out that the original version of C. elegans research is way different than the known cross standard lab version, and then they end up loving it.
Excellent, thank you. Pam, do you have any comments on efforts that SACNAS or other organizations you've been working with, what efforts they might be putting towards K through 12 education?
Yeah, the organization itself really focuses on undergrad and up because we really see a need for diversifying within academia. There's something like 75% of the demographics of tenured professors are considered white ethnicity. And so that's really the foundation. But the way that we work in K through 12 is within the chapters. There's a lot of chapters that do outreach within their local community. So I know even an example would be here at UNT, our local chapter does science fair judging to our different K through 12 platforms, as well in schools, districts, as well as giving talks. I myself go to talks and give talks at high schools, things like that. So that's where the work of that gets done at a community level within the chapters.
Excellent, thank you. Needy, we had a question about using diversity statements in yearly evaluations or in tenure evaluations rather than in the initial hiring process. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, so we just started doing that at UC, and I think a lot of other institutions are doing that. Again, I think it depends on the commitment to equity when you're evaluating those diversity statements. And so we'll just have to see if they're actually used. I'm excited at the prospect of them being used during the merit process after hiring, so that all of that invisible work that minoritized faculty often take on now gets visible. But until I see it, I'll believe it when I see it.
So we had a question from an attendee who asks, race-based and religious-based discrimination and biases are prevalent in academia. Stereotyping people of different backgrounds is very common. Could any of the panelists comment on what and how we as a community can collectively create awareness about this issue? So what can we see elegans researchers do?
You know, I think being an ally is very important. And so having that empathy and understanding what other individuals may be experiencing and being there for them. So necessarily calling it out if you see that, or maybe redirecting conversations. So it depends upon the scenario. There's also examples within, you know, just really looking at how your own institute is set up. Are there policies that might be discriminatory? You know, is there different practices? Is the way that the choices of who's going to be on specific committees, you know, the committees that might have power versus the ones that don't, are you speaking up and saying and inviting others to be on those? And so there's so many things that I think we just get used to during our day. But if we pause and we look at it, we'd probably identify ways in which we could dismantle various aspects. And my other advice is not to take it all on at once because it's so daunting. But you know, my approach has been through the years, just try to pick and choose what I'm going to work towards for sustainability.
One of the things that I've found from a research perspective, having now seen it through the eyes of Oglethorpe and through Emory University, which are completely different, you know, viewpoints. And I find that, you know, in graduate admissions and even evaluating graduate students, many of the faculty who have come, you know, just straight through from R1 institutions, they have really no idea what an impact some of the things that they were exposed to, you know, what a difference that makes. We've seen it in some of our surveys. So I think awareness of the different backgrounds, so many people attribute, you know, deficiencies in backgrounds to race when a lot of them are, of course, deficiencies in opportunity. And I think, you know, making people aware of that is so important.
I would also add, I think that we can learn a lot from listening to people. I think a lot of times we make assumptions about what we think people need or what people how they would like to be responded to, but really listening to some of our graduate students, some of our undergrads about their experiences and not taking it personally and seeing it not as an attack of the institution or an attack on the department, but as a responsibility to make things better. There's a lot that we could learn from our minoritized grad students, minoritized undergrads, and minoritized faculty members about their experiences that could then get factored into improving and dismantling some of those barriers.
Excellent, thank you all. I think allyship and listening are active. I think that's something that's really important to remember. You know, they're not passive things that you do. Being an ally is an active thing, and listening is an active thing. So we're coming up on the end of our session. So I'm going to leave one more question for each of the panelists. It's a very large question, so go ahead and pick, you know, whatever small part of it you'd like to tackle. But we've had a lot of questions about finding the support for these various projects that you're doing, whether it's funding through funding agencies or getting buy-in from leadership or things like that. Do you have a small piece of advice on how to find those opportunities, or how to go about turning or getting the resources to make an idea real? Like I said, it's a very large question. I'm sorry.
For us, it's been very, very difficult. I mean, you know, we funded our project off of a small part of my individual NSF grant that was allotted to me based on my own research at the R1 institution, right? So that was not something that was ever going to be accessible to Karen, for example, at Oglethorpe. So obviously NSF is an ally, and they have broader impacts that are really important. So I would encourage, R1 researchers who might be thinking R01, maybe to go that route and try to put more effort into it. But I think this is a big problem. There are not a huge amount of resources to support these kinds of programs.
I would say for faculty hiring, it basically, you've got to take a long view. The resources, I started talking about this in my department for maybe, let's see, it's 2021, probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And I brought it up at, every faculty meeting, every search committee meeting. And it took seeing where the resistance was and then coming up with a strategy for that piece of resistance, and then seeing what the next stage of resistance was and coming up with a strategy for that. And it took informal conversations with other members of my department so that they could then say, oh, actually we should be dealing with this. And then it took somebody doing an experiment on their own with diversity statements, where they use diversity statements for the first time in a faculty search. And everyone who got invited for interviews was a woman, right? It took all of these small experiences of recognizing resistance, determining strategies, and having conversations that shifted other people's mindset about what our responsibility was regarding faculty hiring. And then eventually with our cluster hire that happened last year, that took administrative support. And that required both a grassroots level of responding to resistance. And I'm going to reiterate that, because there will be resistance. And then there also took administrative muscle, saying when there was resistance at the departmental level, to say, no, actually, this is a priority. You should be thinking about this. Mm-hmm. And so there is no single silver bullet that will solve these problems. It takes constant observation. It's just like doing experiments. It takes constant observation, shifting of strategies, shifting of responses, and seeing what works at your institution. And eventually there'll be somebody in an administrative will be like, actually, we should be doing this. And I'm like, yeah, but you take advantage of those opportunities because you've been laying that groundwork and laying that foundation. And so you have to have a long view.
Excellent. Pam, we have 3 more minutes left if you have a comment.
Well, I wear 3 hats as a PI, getting money for my students and getting resources for the university. Also my hat as an administrator in the university, so getting training grants and so forth, really talking and promoting the ideas throughout. We're an HSI, so it's not as hard. We're an R1 HSI at UNT, but we weren't always. And so the University of North Texas that I came into versus now is different. And I'd like to think that, a group of us helped move us towards that. But wearing the hat of a president for SOCNAS, resources is always a challenge. It's something that always would make my stomach hurt when I think about it, because it has to continue. And so really reaching out to the funding agencies, them getting to know you. So NIH and NSF knows SOCNAS and the work and the good work that the organization has done, as well as reaching out to other sectors, private sectors, to be able to, and foundations to get funding. And so for me, it's about looking everywhere and thinking about who would listen and who's going to provide support for specific initiatives.
So I'm going to reiterate what Sarah just sent to everybody. So before we get shut off, that we thank you all who attended this session, the panelists and all the attendees. I think it was excellent. I sincerely hope that we've started a new tradition here in the WORM community, and that we will have these set aside sessions each year from now on. And I encourage everybody to do what they can in their own labs or in their own person to help increase our diversity, equity, and inclusiveness of our society and of your lab. And we look forward to in the future seeing lots more abstracts on DEI submitted to the WORM meeting. and to see what comes in the next couple of years, because I think we're a strong community and this is only going to make us stronger. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Anna and Sarah.
Thank you. I also want to say that I didn't answer some questions because it was hard to answer questions by typing. So if people want to email me, I'm happy to take questions that way.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody, and have a nice afternoon.